almost Christmas time, which means that it is time for my final unhaul of 2024 so that I can get these 34 books out of my house before we start to get ready for the festive period. Speaking of the festive period, before we get into talking about the books, I would like to talk to you guys a little bit about the sponsor of today's video, which is the wonderful Wild, who have sent me their entire festive wintry range, and I am very excited about it. So if y'all don't know who Wild are as a company, if you don't know their ethos, if you don't know why you should be investing in this brand, they are a sustainable toiletry company who are dedicated to revolutionizing the way that we think about bathroom and toiletry waste. All of their products come in entirely recyclable packaging. The refills for their deodorants, their shower gels, their lip balms are all compostable. You get refillable aluminium cases to put your cartridges in, so you're never throwing those away, and none of the packaging that any of your orders comes in is single-use plastic or any of that. Like, it is all either recyclable or compostable. Something very exciting about the range that I have to show you guys today is that Wild have recently collaborated with Emma Bridgewater to bring this limited edition range of cases. You can get your Emma Bridgewater case for your shower gel, your deodorant, for your lip balm, and for every order of the Emma Bridgewater range that is placed, Wild are going to be planting 2 trees. They always plant 1 anyway, but for this limited edition range, they are going to be planting 2 instead. As well as the Emma Bridgewater cases, Wild have also sent me their entire wintry scent range, which is super exciting. So across the shower gels and the deodorants, we have Sugar Plum Fairy, Arctic Ice Queen, and also Enchanted Forest. If y'all know me, you will not be surprised that Sugar Plum Fairy is my favorite scent because it is the sweetest of the 3 that we have. Arctic Ice Queen is a little bit more minty. This one, the Enchanted Forest, is a little bit more green, and Sugar Plum Fairy is the sweet one. It is not overwhelmingly sweet, but it is definitely a fruity fragrance with notes of plum, of course, but also peach and berry in here as well. So I've been working with Wild for a while now, but before that I used Wild myself for I think just over a year because I was personally having issues with deodorant not really working for me, and I wanted to change to something that was very different from what I was currently using, but also something that was full of natural ingredients, gentle on my body. And then the fact that this is also really friendly for the environment is obviously a massive bonus. So if you guys would also like to jump on the Wild bandwagon, I would recommend that you do so right this minute, because I have Wild's biggest discount ever to offer you guys for Black Friday. So if you use my code BOOKS33 before the 2nd of December, you will get 33% off the entire Wild range. So this is your opportunity to grab yourself some cases, plant some trees, maybe even gift some. If anybody's been thinking of trying out Wild, this discount would be a great opportunity to pick up a whole bunch of stuff to give to your loved ones and also gift to yourself. And once again, a big thank you, of course, to Wild for sponsoring my video. So now that I've brought some exciting things into my life, it is time to remove some unexciting things, namely the 34 books that I am going to be unhauling and hope to have out of my house before the middle of December so that I can have a nice, stress-free, clean, clutter-free Christmas. These are mostly a casualty of Shelve It or Scrap It. I have unhauled more than ever this year, and we are still at a ratio of way more unhauls than hauls, and way more books unhauled this year than books that I brought in, which was my desired effect at the beginning of the year, because I didn't want to have more books in total than I currently had at the beginning of the year. And my entire own TBR video is going to be coming up to see whether I have managed to reduce my TBR a little bit. I don't want to like demolish it, but I didn't want it to like be increasing like it has every year. So these are going to be in no particular order, but I did do an episode of Shelve It or Scrap It where I read a bunch of sequels to see if I wanted to continue on with or unhaul the entire series. So some of these can be banded together, including our first series, which is the first 4 books in the Fae Guardian series by Lana Pacherzik. So these ones are a series of Fae romances, but they're very much in the style or the format of paranormal romance, which I am very much not a fan of. We all know this. So I read the first book and I thought it was okay. The main draw of this series to me is that it is in a futuristic, like post-apocalyptic apocalyptic world. It reads like it's a high fantasy world because essentially the world ended and reverted back to basics, and the metal and the plastic of our world is what was blocking magic. So now that all of that has gone away and the world has been born anew, it has given space for fae to be re-entered into the world. And then we also have a series of human women in here who have been frozen since the apocalypse, and in each book one of them is defrosted and she finds her fae mate. So I really liked the concept of these, but they are predominantly a romantic series, so I was getting frustrated because we were focusing more on the romance of the books, which makes sense, but it's the element that I enjoyed the least, when what I really wanted was a lot more complexity and intricacy in this kind of concept we had going on. So I have the first 3 books, which are the Fae books, and then I have the first of the second set of the Fae Guardians, which is the first vampire book that I'm going to be unhauling. If any of you are wondering, I do, because I always get questions about it, I do sell some of my books on Vinted. I know it is not ideal for people in various countries around the world to be able to buy them, but it is the easiest for me to be able to sell on. So if you are at all interested at any point, there is always a link in my description box. A duology that I'm unhauling is the Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. This was a weird series for me because it is literally very, very weird, and I had a roller coaster ride with book 1 where I really enjoyed the contemporary beginnings. It's like a contemporary fantasy set in New York City, and then it went into kind of a fever dream section before it turned into a little bit more of a high fantasy. I kind of was bowled over by this book. I didn't really know what to think of it, but I felt like I had a positive experience because I went in with those kind of low expectations and let it sweep me away. So then when I went into the Night Country, it kind of followed along the same vein, but I didn't feel like it was as well executed. And it was also the kind of series where I wanted to read it and experience it, but after I was done, I was unlikely to keep it anyway. I was going to be fine on hauling it, which it turns out I am. I have a couple of Afterlight romances here. One that I DNF'd very quickly is Clearout by Meryl Wilsner. This is one that I got in the subscription. I don't get Afterlight at all actually now. I'm not subscribed anymore, but this is one that I got within the first year when I wasn't skipping anything. I also wasn't looking up spoilers because if I'd have known it was a football romance, then I absolutely would not have gotten it. So as soon as I started this, I realized that I know I'm not interested in football, but this really hammered it in for me, and I DNF'd it pretty quickly. And then one that I didn't DNF is All the Feels by Olivia Dade. I read this entire thing and I despised it. I did. I didn't know going into it that it was like Game of Thrones actor fanfic, which actor fanfic makes me feel a little bit weird. I also didn't really like the way that the plus size main character was treated in here. It felt weird. Like the way that the male main character described her felt really weird and insulting, and I just couldn't get behind it. Nothing about this I enjoyed, and a lot of it I was actually offended by, so I am very happy to be removing this from my life. One that I very much wanted to love but sadly fell a little bit flat for me is Evocation by S.T. Gibson. I also read Diary of Blood in the same month and I really enjoyed that one, but this, while it had a very interesting premise and a very strong start for me, it kind of got derailed by like a romance in the middle where everyone was too busy trying to figure out whether a relationship with 3 people was going to work instead of focusing on the very imminent possession that was forming the plot of this book. So it kind of really derailed and lost my interest, which is sad because it started off so good, and I also really like the psychic medium magic thing that we had going on in here. One that also started off very strong and I ended up not liking was Mistress of Lies by K.M. Enright, and I am especially sad about this because this is one of my favorite special editions of the year. This is why I love this so much, and I really wanted to love it, and it really did start strong, but it kind of continued on one note throughout the entire thing. It's marketed as a romantasy, which I don't think it is at all, and it's set in a world with like blood magic. There's a vampire king, there's a murder mystery, but I just felt like while it was very atmospheric and it kind of started the story very well, it never peaked anywhere. It kind of stayed on that same flat one note, which 250 pages in started to get really boring, and then it never really kind of have got any more exciting, and the murder mystery I thought was really obvious. So the fact that the characters weren't getting it was also kind of annoying, and also on top of that, they weren't even bothering to investigate it. One that I have had a long time and have finally decided to unhaul is The Court of Miracles by Kester Grant. I remember when this came in an Illumicrate a few years ago, and it was like a standout, stunning edition, and I do really like the edition and also the premise of this book. However, I read this so many years ago and the sequel has still not been released, and at this point I no longer care enough about this book. Like, it was a fast-paced book to begin with, so it wasn't one that was going to lodge itself in my memory for a very long time, but on top of that, it's now been so many years, the sequel is only released next year, and I know I don't care enough about this series to reread this one, to read book 2, and I can't go into book 2 at this point without rereading. I'm pretty sure that this is one that I DNF'd, and I actually don't remember anything about it now, but it is Incendiary by Zoraida Cordova. This one is the Illumicrate edition. I'm sure that it came up in an episode of Shelve It or Scrap It. Oops. And I am assuming that I did DNF it pretty quickly, but I could not tell you why because I have no memory of ever sampling this book at this point. I am unhauling 3 editions, and I'll tell you why I have 3 editions because it's not intentional, of What the River Knows by Isabella Banez. So only one of these purchases was intentional, and that was the Goldsboro edition. So this one was one of the GSFF books. It sounded interesting and I wanted it, so I got it. Like, I picked up this month's subscription. I then worked with Book of the Month and I selected this book without realizing that it was the same book as the Goldsboro one, and then the month later it also came in my Fairy Loot Rep package. So I ended up with 3 editions of this. Now, I have recently read it. I went on a trip to Egypt on Gavin from Gavin Reads It All's Trover Trip, and this was the book that he selected, which was amazing because I needed to read this and decide if I wanted 3 copies of it, and it turns out I don't want any. It's not a bad book by any means. It is a pretty strong, I would say, YA historical mystery series or mystery book. It is following a woman whose parents have died. She's from Buenos Aires and her parents are obsessed with Egypt. They spend most of the year in Egypt, so when she finds out that they've died there, she travels over to figure out what happened to them. It is set in the early 1900s. No, the 1800s. It's the 19th century. There is a magical element, but it does read mainly like a historical fiction, and that kind of action adventure story set in this time period doesn't appeal to me. So while I do think it's good if you are somebody who likes that kind of thing, I don't like that kind of thing. So it was okay. I liked it. I see the merit in it, but I'm not going to continue with the series. So I also unhauled the Malice duology, including the arc of book 2 by Heather Walter. This one is a Sleeping Beauty retelling from the perspective of the character that would be Maleficent. And book 1, I felt, because this is like a villain origin story, I felt like book 1 could have been darker, but I did really like the atmosphere in the world in it, which is what kind of made me continue and want to read book 2, which I thought fell very flat. Like, this was a 3-star for me anyway, so I expected it, like the Hazelwood, to be a series that I read. Was happy to have read it and then unhauled, but this one actually was a disappointment, so it kind of reinforced my wish to unhaul them. I read about half of this anthology, which is The Book of Witches, edited by Jonathan Strahan, and I don't like anthologies. I don't really like short stories. I was going to read this throughout October so that I had read it, and I got halfway through and I was like, okay, some of these stories are okay, but more than a day after reading them, I don't remember what I read, so it's just a big waste of time me reading it. And so I DNF'd it, and I was going to unhaul it anyway, but I didn't even finish it. I am also unhauling the Wicked Saints trilogy by Emily A. Duncan. I'm pretty sure that the series has another name, but this one is a like Russian inspired fantasy series, but the author was the subject of some controversy. It was annoyingly the same year that book 3 was released, so I'd read book 1 and I gave it 3 stars, and I ended up collecting the rest of the series anyway because it was back in a time, I say back in a time, it was a few years ago, where I was a little bit more of a completionist than I am now. Like, now I'm happy to be like, I don't want to read this and I won't continue. But it was just after book 3 was released, it turned out that she was involved involved in bullying a bunch of debut authors to kind of big herself up and make herself seem better. And since then, nobody's heard a peep from her, but I no longer wanted her books on my shelves anyway. Another book that I read recently and I didn't really love was Meddling Kids by Edgar Cantero. This one is a Scooby-Doo-esque horror book set in the 90s. It has some comedy in there as well because of the Scooby-Doo nature of it. And it is one that I wanted to love because I am a massive Scooby-Doo fan, but I found that it was too fast-paced for my enjoyment. It had a lot of like slapstick comedy, which isn't my favorite. I mean, thinking about it, because it's a like homage to Scooby-Doo, that makes a lot of sense, but I didn't like it. And then I also thought that it had a lot of problematic representation in there as well that made me feel like really weird, especially when it comes to discussing, I want to say discussing trans characters. Some of the characters weren't trans, but the way that they were discussed, also knowing that they're not trans, was even weirder than the representation of actual trans characters in here. It was a mess. And then the last 10 books I'm going to be unhauling are all from my most recent episode of Shelve It or Scrap It. So in episode 10, I decided to do a try a chapter version where I sampled 3 to 5 chapters of I think about 14 or 15 books in total, and I had to decide whether I was going to shelve or scrap them based on those chapters, and the video only ended when I unhauled 10 books. So these are the 10 books that I unhauled, all of which because I didn't like them enough to want to continue after sampling the first 3 to 5 chapters. So the first one is Master of One by Jada Jones and Danny Bennett. This is one that I hadn't really heard great things about anyway, and the beginning was okay, just not absorbing enough for me to read it in light of also all those mediocre things I'd heard about it. I then sampled the second book in the Dark Hunters series by Sherilyn Kenyon, which was Night Pleasures. This one is a paranormal romance series, like a really, really long one that is centering around like Greek gods and Greek warriors. I read book 1 and I was pretty ambivalent about it, but I already owned book 2, so I took this opportunity to sample it and finally put this series to rest and say I'm not going to be continuing with this one. I also tried What Monstrous Gods by Rosamund Hodge. I heard some things about this author that I wasn't particularly a fan of, and this book has quite a low rating on Goodreads. I started it and my verdict was kind of that it reads like a pretty mediocre young adult fairy tale story, which at this point in my life is not something that I'm really that invested in. Son of Blood and Ruin by Marielle Lorez. This is a adult fantasy that delves into like the Incan civilization. It started off quite promising with like a detailed and lengthy foreword about the like history, terminology and pronunciation throughout the book, and then I felt like it was just a little bit too action based and not as intricate as I expected from that little bit at the beginning, so I didn't want to continue. Library of Broken Worlds by Elia Dawn Johnson. This has a ridiculously low rating on Goodreads. It's like a 3.1 or something, which is wild, and it is quite poetic and also conceptual, both things that I don't really love. Like I don't get it, and I said this in Shelve It or Scrap It. I don't feel bad. It doesn't make me feel stupid saying that I don't get it. My brain just does not work in a way that is able to process what you mean when you say that you attached a glittering rope to an eyelash and swung through the stars. I don't know what that means. Sorry. The Honey Witch by Sydney Shields. This one starts out set in like the Regency era, which once again is not my favorite time period to read from, but it did get a little bit more promising until I realized that the only thing propelling this plot is some kind of clunky, out of place dialogue that was the entire like first 3 chapters was just everybody info dumping everything about this book in dialogue, and that is just not my preferred writing style. One that actually hurt me was The Curse of Saints by Kate Dramis. This one is it promises to be an enemies to lovers story following a Queen's Guard and also a spy master to the Queen. Sign me up. Am I right? This is one that I wanted to love, but when I read my first 3 to 5 chapters, I just wasn't getting it. Like, it just wasn't sinking in. I felt like it wasn't immersive, it wasn't compelling, and I was upset about it. But given the nature of the challenge, I have to say goodbye. The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. This one was also a little bit sad, not because I enjoyed what I sampled of the book, which was the first 50 pages in audio. Audio production on this, great. Would recommend, but I'm more upset because N.K. Jemisin is an author that a lot of people love, although I do know there's polarizing opinions where some people love like some of her books and dislike others, and then other people like the ones that people heavily dislike and don't like the other ones as much. So this one was once again very conceptual, very intangible. It's about people who are embodied by the spirits of boroughs of New York, and they are fighting an evil that has tentacles that wraps around the city, but only those people can see it. Normal people don't see tentacles trying to kill the city. I couldn't get behind it. Like, is it happening? Is it not? I don't know what's going on. I do still have the audiobook of this though, because I got it in an Audible 2-for-1 sale, and like I said, the audio production is really good, and I could see it being something that I do decide to listen to in the future. Sometimes with fantasy, I have to read and listen along at the same time, but with this, I had no trouble following the first 2 chapters in audio, so if I do want to revisit this in the future, I'll probably just go straight down the audio route. One that I thought I was maybe going to enjoy a little bit more until I read the synopsis properly was The Thorns Remain by J.J. Harwood. This one is a romance between a Fey Lord and a mortal woman, which signed me up. Like, that is exactly the kind of thing that I'm into. But what I didn't realize is that it was set in the early 1900s, just after, I think, World War I, and it's set in a small Scottish village. So the first 50-60 pages of this is just our main character, who I think is called Moira Jean, going around the village talking to the baker about buns and the carpenter about tables and the village boys about farming, and I don't care. I know it gets fantastical, but I just didn't want to wait around until that actually happened. And then the lowest rated book probably in this entire stack, according to Goodreads, is The Kingdom is a Golden Cage by Lily Inkwood, with a 2.8 rating on Goodreads. I know, right? It's real bad. This one is an adult fantasy that reads very much like a middle of the road young adult, and I mean middle of the road in terms of age range, not in quality. Maybe you like this book, and if you do, I am happy for you, but I could not get behind the fact that the love interest is a cat. And in terms of this being a fairy tale-esque story, you know, that makes sense. It happens. Like, princes turn into frogs all the time. It's something the princesses have to deal with, but she kept stroking him. Knowing that he was a man, she was stroking him, and he like speaks to her and caresses her face with his paws in the prologue, and I just couldn't cope with that. It is also definitely not an adult book. It felt very much not adult. So those are all of the books that I'm unhauling in this round. I am sorry if I unhauled one of your faves. For a lot of these, like, some of them I genuinely disliked, but a lot of them, it's just kind of like I didn't feel like I was, especially with those last 10, like they could be fine, but I didn't feel like I was invested enough to want to invest any more of my time in them, which I feel like at this point there are so many books and there's so little time, and I want to read the best books. I don't want to read okay books, like I want to read the real good books. And so some books that I'm just not feeling as much, I kind of have to just go with my gut if I feel like they're not for me, so that I can pursue things that I enjoy a little bit more. Because I'm currently reading a book that I am really absorbed by. It's not the best book I've ever read, but like the world is falling away when I'm reading it, and I miss that feeling. Like, I'm not getting that feeling super frequently anymore, so it's time for average books to say goodbye, I'm afraid. Down in my comments, I guess leave me an emoji. Leave me a rose emoji for The Kingdom is a Golden Cage, because it's covered. It's literally covered in roses. I normally say, like, let me know if you liked any of these books, but as I'm unhauling them, don't do that. Just don't do that. Don't make me feel worse. But aside from that, guys, once again, a big thank you to Wild for sponsoring this video. And please do not forget, if you would like to get 33% off the entire Wild range, then you can either scan the QR code on screen or click on the link at the top of my description and enter my code BOOKS33 at checkout. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon if you would like to follow me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.